welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. For this Thanksgiving week, I am going to be reading a novella I wrote in 3 parts. It's a Star Trek story called Enterprises of Great Pitch and Moment. In 2007, as part of the celebration of the 20th anniversary of Star Trek The Next Generation, I put together a 6-part miniseries of novellas that were published as ebooks called SLINGS and ARROWS. SLINGS and ARROWS chronicled the first year of the Enterprise E. In the movie Star Trek First Contact, we were introduced to the Sovereign-class USS Enterprise, NCC 1701E. LaForge mentioned in dialogue in that movie that the ship had been in service for a year. However, while there has been a considerable amount of tie-in fiction, both in prose and in comics and in gaming, that have chronicled adventures of the Enterprise E beyond the 3 movies that it appeared in, almost none of them took place in that first year. There was Diane Carey's Ship of the Line, which chronicled the maiden voyage of that ship. There was the Section 31 novel Rogue by Andy Mangels and Mike Martin, which focused on the character of Sean Hawke, who was killed in the movie First Contact. And that was it, really. A couple short stories, and that's it. And at that time, during the 4th and 5th seasons of Deep Space Nine, there was a lot of stuff going on. There was martial law was declared on Earth. There was major concern over changeling infiltration from the founders of the Dominion. The Maquis were a major threat. The Klingons and the Cardassians were fighting a war against each other. The Klingons had pulled out of the Khitomer Accords and were no longer allies with the Federation. The changeling infiltrators had hit the Federation, had hit the Klingon Empire, replacing General Martok. Plus, on top of that, there were more smaller issues, like the fact that sometime in that year, Data learned how to turn off his emotion chip. LaForge's visor was replaced with optical implants. Also, we saw on Deep Space Nine that Lwaxana Troi was pregnant, and other stuff too. So, and also that William Riker's transporter twin, Thomas Riker, had joined the Maquis. So, with all of that, we did this 6-part miniseries. I wrote the final volume, which I'm going to read for you now, which was, again, called Enterprises of Great Pitch and Moment, which was also a Next Generation Deep Space Nine crossover. It actually teams the 2 crews up, something we didn't really see much on screen, partly due to actor availability and shooting schedules and such, but in prose we're not constrained by such things. So this was an opportunity to do a general Next Gen DS9 team-up, and in particular, a Sisko-Picard team-up, which we hadn't seen since DS9's premiere episode, Emissary. So, without further ado, here is part 1 of Enterprises of Great Pitch and Moment, which is dedicated to the memory of Gene Roddenberry and Michael Piller, 2 fine writers now lost to us, but whose work will live on forever. Chapter 1. The Palais de la Concorde, Paris, Earth. The first time Jean-Luc Picard set foot in the Palais de la Concorde, he was 8 years old, taking a class trip to visit the seat of the Federation government in Paris, only a short aircar ride from his home in Le Bar. One of his classmates, a girl named Martine, had said she had hoped to meet President Lycan, though Jean-Luc had thought the girl stupid to think so. Indeed, they had not met the president, who was vacationing on Alpha Centauri, which, their teacher explained, was why they had been able to arrange the tour. They met several other people who worked for the government, including Lycan's chief of staff, a very gregarious and friendly Denobulan, but none of them were the president, and therefore were of less interest to a group of 8-year-old children. Their teacher admonished them for this. The Federation government was far more than a single person, and the importance should be placed, he felt, on the structure where the work of government took place. But to a group of children who had only really known one president in their lifetimes to date, it was a disappointment. Now it was 60 years later, and Picard was in the Palais once again, having lived through the regimes of half a dozen or so presidents, from Lycan's successor, Thelian, to the recently departed Jarish Inyo. He suspected that his 8-year-old self would never have imagined that the president of the Federation would personally summon him to the Ragora tray room, but then his 8-year-old self probably didn't anticipate being captain of the USS Enterprise either. Picard had met President Min Zeif when he had been a counselor, representative of Belarus to the Federation Council. His landslide victory at the end of the previous year over Jarish Inyo had been taken by many as a mandate for change, especially since Jarish Inyo lost with a smaller percentage of votes than any incumbent president who had chosen to run for re-election in the Federation's history. Indeed, Picard had been surprised to see the Grazerite choose to run again at all. Admiral Layton had tricked him into declaring martial law, an abuse of power that led to the resignations of many high-ranking Starfleet personnel, and also to the death of Picard's friend, Admiral Eric Hahn. Picard himself had voted for a third candidate, Governor Rel Obertag of Betazed, whose platform was less militaristic than that of Zeif. The summons to Earth had come just as Picard had finished viewing the opening night of Beverly Crusher's most recent play. Her excellent production of A Christmas Carol had ended its run shortly after the 2373 New Year, and over the next few months, she had produced a run of plays of her own. Requiem for a Martian, based on a book that Picard had loaned to the good doctor. The latest piece was Arms and the Man, with Deputy Chief Engineer Paul Porter making an excellent Blunchley. When he had said that he would beam down to the Palais with his first officer and chief of security, the staff person who had made the call, an elderly Zaknorn woman, said no. "The President only wishes to speak to you, Captain Picard, and I'm afraid that Palais security will only allow you entrance to the building." That was that, then. Fear of changeling infiltration had caused the security in the Palais, already the most secure location in the Federation, to grow even more intense. Given that the Enterprise itself had had its security chief replaced with a changeling less than a year ago, not to mention the revelation of a few months previous that General Martok, one of the highest-ranking soldiers in the Klingon Defense Force, was also a shape-changer, Picard could hardly blame them. So when the Enterprise arrived at Earth, Picard beamed down alone, arriving at the second-floor transporter station and then being escorted by two members of the President's security detail to the meeting room on the 15th floor. He took a seat at the far end of the large round table from the door. And then he waited. After an interminable period that the wall chronometer insisted was only 15 minutes, the doors finally parted to reveal not President Zeif, but a short, stout Zaknorn, who walked in purposefully. Behind him was an elderly woman in an admiral's uniform whom Picard did not recognize. "Captain Picard, my apologies for arriving late. I'm Col Azernal, President Zeif's Chief of Staff, and this is our Starfleet liaison, Admiral Hong." Nodding, Hong said, "Captain." "Admiral?" Azernal took a seat next to Picard, Hong taking the next seat after that. "The President regrets that he can't attend this meeting, but I'm empowered to speak for him." For a brief moment, Picard found himself once again feeling the regret of an 8-year-old who'd hoped to meet the President, but that passed quickly. A President's Chief of Staff, he knew, was very much like a captain's first officer. Picard would have trusted Riker with a briefing if it were necessary, so Picard saw no reason not to trust Azernal. Folding his hands on the table, Azernal gazed at Picard with intense eyes over the heavy folds of his cheeks. "We've had a few months to get settled in, Captain, and now it's time we started doing the job we were elected to do. Among other things, it's past time we improved our relationship with the Klingon Empire. We'd hoped that the exposure of the Martok changeling would have done the trick, but Gowron seems committed to remaining outside the Khitomer Accords. Your mission is to change that." Picard blinked. Azernal's directness was in direct contrast to what the captain was used to from politicians. "Mr. Azernal, I'm afraid that has been tried. When Gowron first withdrew from the Khitomer Accords..." Holding up a hand, Azernal said, "Yes, Captain, we're fully aware of the previous administration's attempted use of your relationship with Gowron to change his mind. But at the time, the Martok changeling was still whispering sweet nothings in his ear. We believe that the exposure of the changeling loosened the cork. You're just the man to finish opening the bottle." Letting out a long breath, Picard tugged on his uniform jacket. As the arbiter of succession, Picard had been the one to install Gowron as Chancellor after Kimpek's death. On more than one occasion, Gowron had trusted Picard, something the wide-eyed Klingon did not give easily, especially to a non-Klingon. Azernal, of course, knew this, or Picard wouldn't be here. And he was right. Gowron might be more amenable to Picard's coaxing now. "Very well. Good. Report to Deep Space Nine immediately." That surprised Picard. "There are bases more proximate to the Klingon border." "True, but DS9's right on the cusp of the border conflict with the Cardassians. And besides, Captain Sisko also has a relationship with Gowron. He got him to back down from attacking DS9 last year, and he's the one who exposed the Martok changeling. I'm hoping that will help." At that, Picard couldn't help but squirm in his seat. But he said nothing. His issues with Sisko were personal, not professional. "Very well. Besides," Azernal added, "Bajor is going to be an important planet in the Federation over the next several years." "Bajor is not part of the Federation." "Not yet, no. This mission is top priority, Captain. No diversions, no side missions. Understood? These are dark times ahead of us, and we need all the allies we can get. It's vital that we and the Klingons are on the same page." Picard was far more curious about the hint he dropped regarding Bajor's admittance to the Federation, but the Zakdorn had already moved on, and so instead he said, "Mr. Azenal, it has been my experience that the Klingons, to use your metaphor, have a completely different book. What you ask may not be possible." "I know, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And contingency plans are in place. We simply prefer not to use them." Picard nodded. "The Enterprise will set course for DS9 immediately." "Excellent." Azenal rose to his feet, Picard doing likewise. "The President's counting on you, Captain." With that, Azenal left the room. It was only then that Hong finally spoke. "I apologize for this summons, Captain. Mr. Azenal is somewhat more hands-on than his predecessors have been." "Given what James Layton was able to accomplish, Admiral, one can perhaps understand the new administration's desire to remind everyone that Starfleet works for the government." Hong's face soured. "There was never any doubt of that." Picard remembered Lieutenant Daniels informing him that he'd found Eric Hahn's body, a death that was the direct result of Layton's attempt to do the very thing Hong was calling into doubt. The Admiral continued. "I don't know if Azenal intends to continue skipping over the links in the chain of command, Captain, but if it eases relations between Starfleet and the Federation Council, I'm certainly all for it." She rose to her feet. "Best of luck, Captain." She walked toward the door, then turned around. The new administration has also made a suggestion for a new uniform design. The specifications have been transmitted to your ship's quartermaster. Your entire crew is expected to be wearing it by the time you arrive at Deep Space Nine." "Of course, Admiral." Picard shook his head in disbelief. This was the fourth uniform change since he'd taken command of the Enterprise D 9 years earlier, after only one uniform change in the years since he joined Starfleet until then. He also got to his feet, and the security guards escorted him to the turbolift. As he rode down to the second floor, Picard wondered how many more of his orders would be coming directly from the Palais from now on. Chapter 2. Federation Starbase Deep Space Nine, Bajoran System. Captain Benjamin Sisko was catching up on personnel reviews when the resonant voice of Lieutenant Commander Worf sounded over the speaker in his office. "Captain, you're receiving a Priority 1 communique from Earth." "Starfleet Command?" Sisko asked. "No, sir. From the Palais de la Concorde." That surprised Sisko. During his brief tenure as head of security on Earth a year earlier, Sisko received plenty of calls from the Palais and visited there on several occasions, most notably when he demonstrated the need for security against changeling infiltration by having Odo disguise himself as part of the furniture in the President's office. But since returning to command of Deep Space Nine after Admiral Layton's abortive coup, instructions from the government tended to be filtered through the Admiralty. "Put it through, Mr. Worf." Activating the small viewer on his desk, it lit up to show the Federation emblem, which was in short order replaced by the face of a Zakdorn female. "This is Captain Sisko."
"Hold for call Azenal, please, Captain."
Back to the Federation emblem. Azenal, Sisko knew, was President Zeif's chief of staff. Sisko had dealt quite a bit with his equivalent in Jarish Inyo's administration, a hyperactive, unjoined Trill woman named Emrys Sill. Sisko had thought rather highly of Jarish Inyo and felt sorry for the way he was manipulated by Layton. Perhaps because he himself was also a victim of Layton's machinations, Sisko found himself voting for the Grazerite for re-election late last year. Based on the voting results, he was one of the few. The emblem once again faded to be replaced by another Zakdorn face, this a male with intense eyes. Sisko recognized the face from several of President Zeif's personal appearances. "Mr. Azenal." "Captain, I'm calling you directly to inform you of the mission I gave the Enterprise yesterday." After the Chief of Staff finished briefing him, Sisko said, "Mr. Azenal, I appreciate your contacting me directly, but the Enterprise will arrive late tomorrow. Restoring the alliance with the Klingon Empire is one of the administration's top priorities, Captain. Don't let us down. Azenal, out." For several seconds, Sisko stared at the viewer. Obviously, it was a top priority if the Chief of Staff himself was going over the heads of any number of admirals to deliver Sisko his orders in person. At least I wasn't summoned directly to the Palais like Picard was, he thought with a small smile. The smile dropped when he thought about having to work with Picard. Almost involuntarily, Sisko called up Picard's service record. The picture was relatively recent, showing a head as bald as Sisko's own, a hawk nose, and intelligent eyes. But that wasn't the face Sisko saw. He saw Locutus of Borg. It had taken Sisko a long time to realize that Picard wasn't Locutus. When they met, right after he transferred to DS9, Sisko had practically jumped down the man's throat, telling him that he was one of the few survivors of Wolf 359, and that his wife wasn't. Picard had recoiled as if he'd been slapped. Shortly after that, Thanks in no part to his encounter with the wormhole aliens, they'd reached a kind of rapprochement. But they'd also never really had to work together. While they'd spoken, and while the Enterprise had docked at the station any number of times, the interactions between the two captains were minimal. That would likely change on this mission. In fact, Azrael had all but ordered it. Sisko wasn't at all sure how he felt about that. Intellectually, he knew Picard was a good captain and a good man. Worf and O'Brien both spoke of him in almost reverent tones, and neither man was one to give their loyalty cheaply. But all Sisko could see when he stared at him was the man who murdered Jennifer. Grabbing the baseball off his desk with one hand, he tapped his comm badge with the other. "Commander Worf, Commander Dax, report to my office." Moments later, the Klingon and the Trill both entered, the former holding a pad in his left hand. He ordered them to take a seat, and then explained the mission. "It's not a bad idea," Jadzia Dax said when he was done. "Gowron owes a debt of honor to both of you." "That is unlikely to be enough for him," Worf said. Gently, Dax said, "I know he cast you out of the Empire, Worf, but it is not merely that," Worf said. During his first year in the Chancellor's chair, Gowron rewrote Klingon history, greatly downplaying the role Captain Picard played in his installation, and his support during the war against the House of Duras. While he was willing to use his relationship with the captain to suit his own ends, such as when the clone of Kahless was discovered, he was far more reluctant to return the favor. Sisko nodded, thoughtfully tossing the baseball back and forth between his hands. "All right, I want both of you to start thinking about ways to approach this. When the Enterprise arrives tomorrow, the three of us and Major Kira will meet with Captain Picard." "Aye, sir," Worf said. "Of course, Benjamin," Dax added. "Good. Dismissed." Worf held up the pad he'd brought in. "Sir, there is one other thing. While you were talking with Earth, we received an alert from Starfleet Intelligence. Some equipment has been stolen from an impound on Starbase 50. "What kind of equipment?" Sisko asked. "It is unclear, as the thieves were able to sabotage the inventory records. However, several items used by Admiral Layton's co-conspirators on Starbase 375 were missing. Evidence suggests that the thieves were Klingon agents." Dax muttered, "That's encouraging. SI promises a full inventory of the stolen items within the day." Sisko nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Worf. Is there anything else?" Worf hesitated, then spoke with clear distaste in his voice. "An alert from the quartermaster, sir. Starfleet is changing the duty uniform again." Both Sisko and Dax smiled at that. The latter said, "What's wrong, Worf? Don't like a little variety in your fashions?" "The Klingon Defense Force has maintained their military armor for over a century. And if this was the Defense Force..." Restraining himself from throwing the baseball at his officers, Sisko said, "Enough! Worf, inform all Starfleet personnel of the change. Dismissed." After the two officers left, Sisko put the baseball back on its small stand. For all that he feared that this mission might prove fruitless, it was necessary to at least make the attempt. The Cardassians and the Romulans had been weakened by the wholesale slaughter of the Obsidian Order and Tal Shiar by the Jem'Hadar, and the Klingons and Federation being at each other's throats for the past year and a half had likewise weakened those two nations, a state of affairs primarily brought about by the changeling disguised as Martok that they'd exposed at Tyga Core. Renewing the alliance with the Empire would go a long way toward reversing those defeats at the hands of the Dominion. The next day, the Enterprise docked at the station, and in short order, Picard and Data came over to the station to meet with Kira, Sisko, Worf, and Dax in the wardroom. Picard was surprised to see that Kira was pregnant and looking very close to term. By way of explaining the android's presence, Picard said as he and Data took their seats, "Mr. Data will be serving as my first officer for this mission. Commander Riker, Commander LaForge, and Lieutenant Daniels are on a separate mission." Sisko nodded. "Very well." Then he smiled mischievously, an expression Picard could not recall seeing on the captain in the past. "I don't think Quark will be terribly disappointed at Mr. Riker's absence." "No doubt," Picard said. An expert gambler, the first officer had broke the bank at Quark's Dabo table on several occasions. Although a new 10-forward bartender may be calling upon him to restock the bar, as it were. When the Enterprise was at the station last year, Amory had obtained some Coberian spirits that the replicator was unable to do justice to, and she'd run out just last month. Picard looked at Sisko and Kira. "By the way, Captain, Major, you'll be pleased to know that I received hints from Col Azanal that Bajor's admittance to the Federation may be happening in fairly short order." Kira straightened. "What kind of hints?" "Simply an inference from the conversation we had at the Palais. It's possible my inference is incorrect." Data added, "However, it would be consistent with the policies of strengthening the Federation that have been applied by the Zeif administration since they took office." "In that case, I wish you people had elected him sooner," Kira said wryly. Picard said, "It could, of course, simply be a political ploy, a method of improving the Federation's strategic position with regards to the wormhole. The reasons don't matter in this case," Sisko said. "Back when I took this assignment, you told me that Bajor's entry into the Federation was the long-term goal." Kira shot Sisko a look. "He did." "I did," Picard said. "Is that a problem, Major?" At first, Kira opened her mouth to speak, then shut it. Then, "If you'd asked me that 4 years ago, Captain, I'd have said yes. Now, though, we'll see what happens," Sisko said quickly. "I, for one, would prefer to wait until someone higher up the food chain than a starship captain informs me." Picard winced, of course. After an awkward pause, Sisko said, "Commanders Worf and Dax have a proposal for how to approach Gowron." Taking the cue, Dax leaned forward in her chair. "Since Tiger Corps, we've been regularly sending messages to Kronos, asking for an opening of negotiations. Just sending another message would probably be met with the same resounding silence we've been getting for months." Worf picked up the ball. "We believe that it would be best to bring the Defiant to the Federation Klingon border, and send the High Council a message that comes from both captains, requesting a formal audience with Chancellor Gowron." "Why not the Enterprise?" Picard asked. Before either Worf or Dax could reply, Data said, "I believe I can answer that, sir. The Defiant is a warship, and the most tactically powerful vessel in Starfleet. The High Council would view such a vessel with more respect than they would the Enterprise." Picard found he could not argue with that logic. "Very well." Kira added, "If the Defiant's not going to be around, I'd feel a lot better with the Enterprise watching the station's back." "That will be your task, Mr. Data," Picard said. "Aye, sir," the android said. There was another pause before Sisko said, "I suggest we depart immediately. Mr. Azaronal made it clear to me that President Zeif considers this mission of the highest priority." "To me as well," Picard said with a nod. Worf said, "The Defiant will be ready for departure in 20 minutes. "Grand," Picard said, getting to his feet. "I will meet you there." He left the wardroom quickly, Data on his heels. As soon as the door shut behind them, Data said, "Sir, I could not help but notice that there was a certain awkwardness between you and Captain Sisko." With a sigh, Picard said, "I could not help but notice it either, Data. I'm afraid that the baggage we each carry regarding the other has remained." "Sir, you are not responsible for the death of Captain Sisko's wife." Smiling sadly as they approached the turbolift, Picard said, "Far easier to say, Data, than to feel." They entered the turbolift. Docking ring. By the way, the other mission that Riker, LaForge, and Daniels go on was chronicled in Book 5 of the miniseries, which was written by Robert Greenberger. Anyway, Chapter 3, USS Defiant, Federation Klingon Border. When Picard had first seen the specifications for the Defiant-class vessels, he had been less than impressed. Starfleet's primary mission had always been that of exploration. While Starfleet was obviously a military organization, with its rank structure and internal regulations and enforcement, it was never militaristic. Its function was to keep the peace, not start the wars. The Defiant flew in the face of that. It was, at its heart, a very big gun. Phasers more powerful than that of any other starship, a huge complement of quantum torpedoes, a considerable amount of power channeled into a stripped-down vessel, bereft of anything but the bare minimum necessary to let the ship function. The sickbay in the specs was also fairly inadequate, which Picard had thought to be short-sighted. As it happened, the sickbay on the Defiant itself was considerably upgraded from the specs he'd seen, no doubt the work of DS9's chief medical officer. Picard had objected to Starfleet Command's decision to construct the Defiant. Command, of course, ignored him, and did so with surprise, since Picard, of all people, knew why the Defiant had been built in the first place, as a weapon to use against the Borg. Now Picard stood to the right of the command chair where Sisko sat. Picard had to admit that his fellow captain looked like he belonged in that chair. Sisko's well-deserved promotion to captain had been long overdue, in Picard's opinion. From the con, Dax said, "Defiant to Ops, requesting permission to disembark." Kira's voice sounded over the speakers. "Ops here. Permission granted. Good luck, Defiant." From one of the side consoles, O'Brien muttered, "We're gonna need it." Now, Chief," Sisko said. "No sense in going into this with a negative mindset." "Hard not to, sir. If blowing up a changeling in front of the Klingons didn't convince him to rejoin the Alliance, I can't imagine this would." He turned around. "No offense, sirs, but if you ask me, this is a waste of time." Picard said, "Our orders came directly from the Palais, Chief." "Oh, well, that explains it," O'Brien said with a chuckle. "Politicians and wastes of time go together like butter on bread." Dax said, "That's why I eat my toast plain." Sisko frowned. "What about that spiced jelly I made for you?" Briefly turning around, Dax said, "That works better on Galzak." Then she turned back 4. "We've cleared moorings." Ahead half impulse, Sisko said. Set course for the Klingon border and engage at warp 9 when we're clear of the station. Dax simply nodded. Worf turned to Dax. Galzak is not food fit for a warrior. Sisko added with a grin, or for my spiced jelly. An English muffin at least, old man. What can I tell you? I'm an Epicurean heathen. Picard marveled at the banter. While he had become far more relaxed with his own senior staff over the years, this level of casual byplay on the bridge was not something he'd ever expect to hear on the Enterprise bridge. He was especially surprised to see it from Worf, though based on the looks he'd seen the Klingon exchange with Dax, he suspected there was more to it than that. The only other time Worf had been this relaxed was when he'd been dating Counselor Troi on the Enterprise D, a relationship that had ended shortly after that vessel crashed. To Dax, Picard said, ETA to the border, Commander. 3 hours, 5 minutes. Picard nodded. I'll be in my cabin, Captain. Sisko nodded back, and Picard turned and left the bridge. He imagined that Sisko breathed a sigh of relief at that. It was always awkward when two captains stood on the same bridge, and even though this was Sisko's ship, Picard was senior to him. In fact, Picard had been the one to give Sisko the assignment to DS9 4 years earlier. It was his fond hope that they would avoid any command conflicts during this mission. One way to avoid that was to let Sisko be the only person in the room who would respond to the word captain for as long as they were en route. Of course, for all he knew, Sisko hadn't felt awkward at all, but damn it, Picard did. Being near Sisko was like dancing on eggshells. Sighing, he entered the cabin that he would be sharing with Worf. Space truly was at a premium on this ship, and called up the most recent issue of the Journal of Archaeological Studies. He had at least 3 hours to kill, after all. As it turned out, it was considerably more than 3 hours. The Defiant's arrival at the Klingon border was met with indifference, and their attempts at communicating with the High Council, or indeed anyone on Kronos, were met with silence, at least for the first 24 hours. After getting a restless night's sleep in the tiny cabin, made after discovering that Worf snored, Picard went to the mess hall to get some breakfast. He saw O'Brien sitting alone, reading over a pad. After getting a croissant with Icoberry jam and an Earl Grey tea from the replicator, Picard approached his erstwhile transporter chief. May I join you, Chief? O'Brien looked up with an annoyed expression, then saw who it was. His face falling, he rose to his feet awkwardly and said, Of course, Captain! Picard smiled. At ease, Mr. O'Brien. I'm sorry, sir, I was just going over the maintenance schedule. The Defiant's a fine ship, but she's a bit overpowered. We've gotten most of the kinks out of her, but most isn't all. Sitting back down to his black coffee and steak and eggs, O'Brien set the pad aside. I was actually sorry that Commander LaForge wasn't on board. I would have liked his input on some of the plasma leakage we've been having, and some communications issues as well. After a hesitation, he added, Actually, if Lieutenant Porter's available. Remembering that LaForge, Porter, and Barclay had all worked with O'Brien and a pair of his engineers the last time they were at the station, Picard said, Of course. I'll put in a request with Mr. Data when we return to the station. Thank you, sir. How are Keiko and Molly? O'Brien's face lit up the room. They're doing fine, and we're expecting another. Yes, I'd heard. Seems to be an epidemic on the station. I'm sorry? Well, I noticed that Major Kira is also expecting. Ah! O'Brien squirmed a bit. Actually, that's Keiko's and my baby. See, there was a shuttle accident, and Keiko was badly hurt. Julian, Dr. Bashir, was forced to move the fetus into the Major. Picard blinked. I see. That was quite selfless of Major Kira. Don't I know it? He sipped his coffee. She's expecting in the next month or so. How is Molly handling the news of a sibling? Chuckling, O'Brien asked, What time is it? She's had every possible reaction across the spectrum. Well, at least Mr. Worf is available to be midwife once again, Picard said with a mischievous smile of his own. Don't tell him that. When Keiko announced she was pregnant, well, I'd never seen quite that look on the commander's face before. Picard laughed, picturing the very expression. Worf was, in his experience, far too easily nonplussed. Though he had done yeoman work in delivering Molly O'Brien during a disaster on the Enterprise D, it was, Picard was sure, not an experience that Klingon was eager to repeat. O'Brien and Picard talked a bit more, catching up on various bits of gossip. The captain found it oddly refreshing. He'd always admired O'Brien's friendly professionalism and had been sorry to see him go. By the same token, the opportunity to become Chief of Operations on DS9 was too good for him to pass up, and he decided to say as much. The job here suits you, Chief. Aside from the day I married you to Keiko, I don't recall seeing you so happy. Oh, don't get me wrong, sir. The job does have its frustrations, but it's been great serving with all these people. He finished lamely. Chief, I won't hold it against you if you say you like serving with your captain. I guess I've been lucky, sir. I've served with the two best captains in Starfleet. Picard thought it would be impolitic to point out that O'Brien had said the exact same thing to Picard once before. Only then the other captain was Ben Maxwell, who was soon thereafter disgraced. He was spared the need to in any case, as Worf's voice sounded over the intercom. Worf to Picard. We are receiving a signal from the High Council. Gowron? No, sir. Catal. Interesting. I'll be right up. Both Picard and O'Brien got to their feet. Who's Catal, sir? A very old, very respected counselor, Picard said as they moved down the corridor toward the bridge. He supervised Gowron's installation during the Civil War against House Duras. In fact, 40 years ago, he served as Chancellor Tag's Arbiter of Succession. O'Brien chuckled. I bet he had an easier time of it than you did. One would assume, yes, Picard said dryly. He was the first non-Klingon to serve in that role, appointed by Gowron's predecessor Kimpek shortly before his death 6 years ago. When they entered the bridge, Sisko was already in the command chair, Dax at Khan. O'Brien moved to sit next to a Worf at one of the tactical stations to the captain's right. Picard's instinct was to ask for a report, but he bit it back. This wasn't his ship. Mr. Worf, Sisko said, what can you tell me about Catal? Worf turned to face his CO. He has served on the High Council longer than anyone still living, and he has served with honor. Dax added, Curzon dealt with him a few times. I think we can trust him. Picard recalled that the Trill's previous host was a Federation diplomat who had a reputation for successfully dealing with the Klingon Empire. Sisko nodded, then turned to Picard. Ready, Captain? Picard nodded. Turning back toward the main screen, Sisko said, On screen, Mr. Worf. The starfield was replaced by that of Catal's elderly, imposing visage. Greetings, Captain Picard, Captain Sisko. I assume this channel is secure. Our nations are at war, Counselor, Sisko said. All channels are secure right now. A wise move. These are difficult times in the Empire. Picard stepped forward, being careful not to move ahead of where Sisko was. For the Federation as well, Catal. It is our hope that we can move past our difficulties and become allies once again. Gowron chose to withdraw from the Kittimer Accords, Captain. That decision was not made lightly. However, he thinks very highly of both of you, and it is for that reason, and that reason alone, that he is willing to meet. Excellent, Picard said. Catal held up a hand. Do not be so quick to agree, Picard. Gowron's conditions are specific and non-negotiable. He will meet with you and Sisko, and only you and Sisko. You must travel in one of your vessel's shuttlecraft to a planet in the Badlands of Gowron's choosing. He in turn will travel in a Defense Force shuttle pod, accompanied only by a single bodyguard. There he will discuss with you the possibility of our nations being allies once again. Picard hesitated. Catal, there is no need for this. We are willing to... I have given you the terms, Picard. I am aware that you are not empowered to make this decision alone. Consult with your superiors. Return to these coordinates in 1 day. I will contact you again and request your answer. Should that answer be yes, I will provide the exact location of the planet. With that, Catal broke off communications. Dax turned around and shook her head. And brusque. Did I forget to mention he was brusque? I have found, Commander, Picard said, that such is a given with Klingon warriors. Glancing at Worf, he added, present company included. Thank you, Captain. Worf deadpanned, which prompted a chuckle from several people on the bridge. Sisko turned to look at Picard. What do you think? Thoughtfully rubbing his chin, Picard said, having the meeting in the Badlands works to our advantage, actually. The plasma storms neutralize Klingon cloaking devices. They can also neutralize a shuttlecraft, Sisko said gravely. True. Picard sighed. We have no proof that Gowron will come alone with but a single bodyguard. Indeed, that would be quite out of character. Sisko nodded. Well, this isn't our mission. Chief, put a call through to Earth. O'Brien winced. We can't, sir. Why not? The Zyth administration has established some new security protocols for contacting Earth. We can do it from the station, but the Defiant comm systems haven't taken to the changes. He glanced at Picard. That was one of the things I wanted Mr. Porter's help with, sir. Picard looked at Sisko. Catal did give us an entire day. Sisko folded his hands together, his index finger steepled and pressed against his chin. All right. Dax, set course for the station. Then we'll have a talk with Mr. Azeroth. Chapter 4. Federation Starbase Deep Space Nine, Bajoran System. Sisko stared impatiently at the face of Call Azernal on the oval-shaped viewer in Ops. Part of the impatience was born of the fact that it had taken O'Brien 20 minutes to set the comm line up and another 15 for Azernal to be available. But mostly it was impatience with the man himself. Captains, why are you even wasting my time with this? This is exactly what we were hoping for. Picard's face showed an incredulity that Sisko shared. Mr. Azenal, meeting Gowron alone on a planet in the Badlands is hardly what a reasonable person can hope for when trying to negotiate an alliance. Gowron's position is tenuous. He has to be careful. Besides, the Badlands are a secure location. And a dangerous one, Sisko said. Dozens of ships have gone missing and presumed destroyed in the Badlands, including the USS Voyager, which was specifically designed to navigate the plasma storms. Yes, but Gowron's taking the same risk as you. If this is not a trick, Worf said. It isn't. Azrael looked away for a moment and said, "One moment, please." Then he looked back. "You don't have all the facts, gentlemen. We've received a few feelers from the High Council about possibly renewing the alliance. Those feelers have come from Catal." Sisko blinked. "You might have mentioned that." "They were just feelers, nothing concrete. This, however, is concrete. Either way, we know Catal can be trusted." "With respect, sir," Worf said tightly, "I disagree. Yes, Councillor Catal is an honorable man, but we do not know that the communication came from Catal. While the message originated from the Great Hall, it did not contain any identifiers that would verify that it came from the House of Catal or from the High Council." "That could have been for security reasons," Azrael said. "Or," Picard said, "it could have been someone wishing us to believe it was Catal in order to get Captain Sisko and myself into the Badlands alone." "You think very highly of yourself, do you, Captain?" Sisko bristled at the insult for all that it wasn't directed at him. To his credit, Picard didn't flinch. "Not at all, sir. But the very connections to the Chancellor that make us the best candidates to talk to him also make us potential targets for those in the Empire who wish our nations to remain at odds." "Gowron himself told us on Tyger Korg that there were those in the Empire who felt that way," Sisko added. "Maybe, but the President wants this meeting, therefore you will take it. Is that understood? I expect you to take the Defiant to the border and agree to Catal's terms, and then take one of the ship's shuttles to the Badlands." Kira suddenly stepped forward. "Excuse me, but we should make at least one change." Azrael frowned. "You're the liaison officer with Bajor, yes, Major Kira?" If Kira was flattered to be recognized, she typically didn't show it. "Yes. I know the Badlands, and I know the Defiant shuttles. They'll get ripped apart. We should at least let the captains go on a runabout. They've got stronger shields and are more maneuverable." "I'd run about Catal before committing, but that's a sound idea, Major. Have one of your runabouts ready to go. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm late for a meeting with the Security Council. The next time I hear from you people, I expect it to be to inform me of a renewed alliance." The communication was cut off as abruptly as Catal's had been. Kira shook her head, and I thought the Chamber of Ministers was full of blowhards. Picard let out a breath. "I have found, Major, that it is endemic to the breed, and thank you for the suggestion of taking a runabout." She looked at Sisko. "Just doing what I can to protect the emissary." Sisko chuckled, and the emissary appreciates it. "Is the Rio Grande ready to go, Mr. O'Brien?" "I'm afraid not, sir. She's still out on that mineral survey." Sisko turned to Dax. "You told me they'd be back this morning." Dax winced. "They were supposed to be, but..." Holding up a hand, Sisko said, "Never mind. What about the Zambesi?" O'Brien said, "She's ready to go on Pad C, sir." Looking at Picard and indicating the turbo lift, Sisko said, "Shall we?" "Indeed." As they both approached the turbo lift, Sisko said, "Mr. Worf, take the Defiant back to the border. Let Catal know we're on our way to the Badlands. As soon as you have the coordinates, send them along." "Aye, sir." Stepping in next to Picard and turning around, Sisko said, "Major, keep the home fires burning. We'll be back before you know it." "I hope so, Captain. Good luck. To both of you." "What about Pad C?" Sisko said, and the lift started downward. To be continued on Wednesday. Thank you very much for watching. Please have a very good and safe Thanksgiving. And please check me out online. You can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD. You can read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com and just generally find links to my books and links to my social media on my website at DeCandido.net. Thank you very much, and I'll see you Wednesday. Please, please stay safe.